During the years of the War of Independence, the name Pierrepoint was known to every Republican in Dublin, and the name was quite feared because Pierrepoint was the hangman, and a date with him meant the end of your life. In his statement to the Bureau of Military History, the Republican Bernard Byrne, who was active in the intelligence war with the IRA, remembered how on the eve of the execution of 6 men in Mountjoy, our information was to the effect that Pierrepoint would stay in the Gresham Hotel and be collected there about an hour prior to the fixed time for the executions. But alas, it wasn't to be. Byrne telling us, there was a full muster of the squad on that morning, as we were all particularly anxious to take part in this particular job, which we felt would be a highlight in our careers and which we hoped would have a slight deterrent effect on others who might be tempted to fill a similar position. Unfortunately, the British were not quite as simple as we'd led ourselves to believe, and the Gresham Hotel story would appear to have been sent out merely as a red herring. Pierrepoint did not stay in a hotel during his visit here and was, in fact, here 2 or 3 days prior to the executions. He stayed in Mountjoy all the time under the protection of the Tans, Byrne lamented. Now, that was Thomas Pierrepoint, and such was the life of a hangman hiding from the gunman. The Pierrepoint family name became synonymous with the business of execution. And while that meant hanging Irish Republicans in 1921, it more often meant hanging criminals. This was an intergenerational business, and the most famous of the family, nephew of Thomas Pierrepoint, was Albert, who would even pen a memoir.
Before considering whether we should continue to hang men and women, here precisely is what is done to them. These facts were given in evidence before the Royal Commission.
My name is Albert Pierrepoint, and I was executioner for 25 years.
Albert Pierrepoint helped end the lives of at least 430 people. Now, the number may be much higher, and we'll get into why there's confusion around that later on. And when you pick up his memoir, which was a best-selling memoir, the very first thing the reader encounters in the book does give you real cause for pause. I operated, on behalf of the state, what I am convinced was the most humane and the most dignified method of handing out debt to a delinquent, however justified or unjustified the allotment of debt may be. And on behalf of humanity, I trained other nations to adopt the British system of execution. I do not now believe that any one of the hundreds of executions I carried out has in any way acted as a deterrent against future murder. Capital punishment, in my view, achieved nothing except revenge. The book, Executioner, Pierrepoint, is a thrilling read at times, but that conclusion is pretty sobering, and after working in 9 countries, he looked back on it all, I think, with a degree of confusion. I believed in what I was doing. I tried to join some dignity with debt. I had an ambition. I have it no longer. All the desire is quite gone. There are, on occasion, brilliant tours of Mountjoy Prison. That's many years since I got in and went on one. Retired prison officer Sean Reynolds, just the kind of person who should be running a museum like that. He knew every inch of the place. And there are moments like seeing the large metal triangle that the guards would strike, jingle jangle, that are interesting to anyone who loves Dublin past. There are exhibits ranging from Republican prison craft to makeshift tattoo guns and ways of producing drink, moonshine. But when you enter a place where lives were ended, the air changes completely. There's no humour in it, and there's a heaviness about it. And as we'll hear today, the Pierrepoint family, they did not begin the practice of putting prisoners to death here. In earlier times, the spectacle could be a morbid and an obscene one, but their story as outsiders, thrust into the storm of Irish life, is a really fascinating one. Thank you all so much for tuning in. A special thank you to those of you who support the podcast on Patreon. That support allows the research that goes into every episode of this podcast. It allowed me to buy a copy of Pierrepoint's book, for example. I got it from the bookshop.ie, brilliant online resource, great friend of the podcast as well. There's some real gems on there. It's a book I've always wanted to read, and no better chance to read it than for this episode. So enjoy this one. In the markets area, a handball alley and a playground are joined by a statue of the Maid of Erin holding a mournful wreath. It's at the meeting place of Green Street, Halston Street, and Little Britain Street, right beside that cocktail bar, 1661. And that statue of the Maid of Erin is a reminder that you're standing at what was once the Newgate Prison. The inscription on the monument says that within this park once stood Newgate Prison, associated in dark and evil days with the doing to death of confessors of Irish liberty who gave their lives to vindicate their country's right to national independence. Standing there now, amidst the laughter of playing children, it's kind of hard to imagine a different time when huge crowds of people would gather for public executions. Not all who went to the gallows at Newgate were confessors of Irish liberty. The first man to meet his end was Patrick Lynch, hanged on the 4th of January 1783, tried and sentenced only a day earlier for robbing a man, Mr. Dowling, and firing 2 pistol shots at him in the process. And less than 24 hours after his conviction, Lynch, a member of a sizable criminal gang in the city who'd been tried previously for several robberies and burglaries, appeared on the front steps of the prison. The executioner fixed the noose around his neck, attaching it to the mechanical apparatus on the first landing, and then Lynch, to quote one source, was suddenly hoisted up in the air by a pullet affixed to the window just above the front door. The Dublin Evening Press described the hanging apparatus in great detail. A tremendous apparatus for the execution of criminals is fixed to the front of the Newgate in the Little Green. It consists of a strong iron gibbet with 4 pulleys of the same metal, underneath which is a hanging scaffold on which the fated wretches are to come out from the centre window, and on a signal, the supports of the scaffold are drawn from under it, and the criminal remains suspended. His body swung there from noon until 4 in the afternoon, witnessed by thousands of people. It was a very grim spectacle, and to such an extent that in the aftermath it was decided bodies should not be suspended for more than an hour at future hangings. And Dubliners, with that morbid wit that they have, christened the device that had ended the life of Mr. Lynch, the City Crane. Strange as it now sounds, the spectacle at the Newgate was considered progress of a sorts. It replaced the time when the soon-to-be killed were basically paraded through the city in a cart on their way to a location near Stephen's Green, where executions previously occurred. And at Kilmainham, the whole thing, because this didn't just happen, of course, at the Newgate, it also happened at Kilmainham. At Kilmainham, the whole thing took on the feeling of a festival. I mean, the late historian Micheál Ó Divleán, guide at the jail who knew it inside out, wrote about how it was said up to 5,000 people would make the trip to Kilmainham jail for a particularly notorious or famous person's hanging, until public executions were eventually banned. Alcohol was sold, and toffee apples and hot cakes by hawkers. Pickpockets plied their trade, and frequently the army and cavalry were present to control the crowds. Now, in time, executions moved to within the walls of prisons, not happening outside of them. And that was the arena in which the Pierrepoint family excelled. Henry Pierrepoint, father of the famous Albert, was born in 1877 in Nottinghamshire. And he wrote a series of reflective pieces on his career, serialised in British newspapers in 1916. Many notorious people passed through his hands, the ad said. And of these persons, Mr. Pierrepoint will have astonishing revelations to make. Henry told the story of how he arrived one day at the door of Strangeways prison, got the job, was sent for training, which involved hanging dummies and sandbags, but nothing prepares you for the real thing. And Albert Pierrepoint was a boy of 11, reading all about his father's career in the press. Now, reading about your old fella hanging people, what effect would that have on you? Well, Albert wrote, "In my imagination, and it was all imagination, death was adventure. Certainly when you met it individually, less glamorous perhaps when you lined up for it by the thousand. Death was adventure and execution was romance. I had all the confirmation I needed on that point from my father's account of his first execution." Henry would hang more than 100 people, but this was a job that brought with it real psychological hurdles. And in his history of capital punishment in Britain, Simon Webb notes that Henry's downfall was quite sad. Quote, "It was caused by the same problem which had bedeviled many hangmen over the centuries, that is to say, drink. At one hanging, Pierrepoint was drunk, launching an attack on his assistant John Ellis, who we'll hear more about later on, leading Ellis to complain to the Home Office, which was the end of Henry's career." But in Henry's working life, he'd also worked with his own brother, Tom, whose career was to be a formative influence on Albert Pierrepoint. The brothers worked together in Dublin, for example, at the hanging of Joseph Heffernan in Kilmainham in 1910. Heffernan sentenced to die for the murder of 32-year-old Mary Walker in Mullingar. Heffernan had tried to take his life on a number of occasions in custody, and his execution was a really strange affair. As Webb writes, it took 2 priests to console Heffernan, and, quote, because the corridor was so narrow, and due to the fact that there were 2 priests instead of the usual 1, the procession to the gallows developed into something of a rugby scrum rather than a solemn and dignified walk. The priests were still clustered round the condemned man, who was stumbling forward in a daze. When they reached the execution chamber, the various officials positioned themselves around the narrow edge of the trapdoors. Tom Pierrepoint pinioned Heffernan's legs, while his brother placed the noose around the victim's neck, was pulling the white hood over his face. The 2 executioners then darted off the drop. Henry Pierrepoint was just about to pull the lever when he noticed to his horror that the priests were still consoling Heffernan. Heffernan himself was swaying and was obviously on the verge of collapsing. Henry rushed onto the drop and pushed the priest out of the way roughly, and then got his brother to stand next to the fainting man to support him. As soon as everything was ready, Tom darted off the trapdoors and Henry pulled the lever. It was one of the worst executions that either man had experienced. Certainly, you'd never forget such a thing. Thomas Pierrepoint could have been any number of things. He worked on a farm, he worked with an illegal bookies, he worked in deliveries, but he followed his brother, and unlike Henry, he was still in it later in life. He worked into his mid-70s. Time magazine would write, "Old Thomas Pierrepoint was a good craftsman. He had a keen eye for sizing up the strength of his subject's neck muscles. He always tied the noose so that it would break the vertebrae at the first snap and spare the poor blighter a lot of agony. He was discreet about his job, never talked to newsmen, never sold souvenirs. He well earned his 15 guineas for each hanging job. But, as Miss Pierrepoint said, chief trouble is, the job's not a regular one." It was Thomas Pierrepoint who Republicans detested during the years of the Irish Revolution, and by then John Ellis, who had played no small role in the sacking of his brother, was also of great importance. It was Ellis who hanged Roger Casement. There was fury in Ireland at the way Casement had been treated, kept in the Tower of London, stripped of his knighthood, hanged like a criminal. And the infamous Dr. Crippen, also hanged by Ellis. But Ellis struggled with the job, attempting to kill himself. He did shoot himself in 1924 after getting intoxicated, an offence for which he was prosecuted, suicide being a criminal offence. And for the Republican movement, Pierrepoint and Ellis were nothing less than enemy combatants. In one bureau statement, a volunteer based in Britain recalled how, with executions looming in Derry, IRA men in Britain were told to, quote, take a car from Liverpool and go to Rochdale, where John Ellis lived, and keep his house under surveillance, pending further instruction. Negotiations were going on at the time, and the executions at Derry were to be discussed. If the men were reprieved, we were to take off in our car for Liverpool. If not, we were to make sure that Mr. Ellis would not reach Derry. As it happened, the men were reprieved, and Ellis never knew who was hanging around outside of his house. But another fascinating story concerns Thomas Pierrepoint, and Thomas Malone, a Republican prisoner in Cork jail, recalled that a gun was actually smuggled into the prison on one occasion with the intention of killing Pierrepoint. The chaplain was to bring in and give me a revolver. Arrangements would be made through the friendly warder, I suppose, that my cell door would be left open about the time that the executioner, Pierrepoint, the prison governor and chief warder, were going out for an execution. My cell was on the first landing and was therefore a little bit above the level of the heads of those going out on the ground floor. I was to crawl along the landing, wait until the chief warder opened the door, and I was to shoot Pierrepoint and then make a rush for the outside. Now, in the end, that execution in Cork never came to pass, but there's no doubt Malone and other young IRA men would have been willing to shoot the hangman if given the opportunity. Emotions could be high around executions during the War of Independence. Tens of thousands of people were outside Mountjoy in March 1921 when 6 IRA men were executed. They murder the innocent in vengeance, the Come on the Mon banner proclaimed outside the prison. But to Tom Pierrepoint, it was simply doing business. And in post-independence Ireland, there was still business to be done. Capital punishment remained a part of life, to the horror of some people. This was regarded by some as a very un-Irish thing to do. But I think perhaps the horror of the Civil War and the widespread policy of executions during that war had maybe desensitised the public somewhat to death and prison. And David Doyle and Ian O'Donnell, writing about capital punishment in post-independence Ireland, they make what I think is a really important point. And David Doyle's work on this subject is great in general. But they wrote, despite retaining the death penalty, it did not prove possible to find a willing executioner within this country. When the need arose, one or two of the Pierrepoints travelled across the Irish Sea to place the noose around the condemned person's neck. The fact that external assistance was required for this gruesome purpose speaks volumes about the level of public antipathy and unease, perhaps even revulsion, towards the practice. It would be 1932, in Christmas time, when Albert Pierrepoint first worked with his uncle John, and Dublin would be the city in which his grim career began. One reason is kind of unclear just how many executions Albert Pierrepoint was involved in, or can be, associated with his name, is that opens the question of what about jobs where he served as assistant, as number two to his uncle. And before departing for Ireland, Albert remembered his uncle producing an enormous revolver on the family dinner table, a, quote, wicked-looking black weapon firing bullets of much larger calibre than a rifle. And it was the first hint I got that being an executioner might be a dangerous job. My mother was terrified, both at the revolver and at the idea that it was necessary to carry it. Executioners, Uncle Tom explained to him, were not particularly popular in Ireland. On they went to the Holyhead boat and for Ireland. And in his memoir, he captures a journey vividly. Priests drinking bottled Guinness, farmers, soldiers and sailors going home to Ireland in their civvies. When they arrived at Dún Laoghaire, it was clear to Albert that the imminent hanging of Patrick McDermott was the subject everyone here was talking about. They heard chatter amongst the people about this forthcoming execution. Here's a contemporary newspaper report about that hanging. Patrick McDermott, a young Irish farmer who murdered his brother, was executed at Mountjoy prison on Thursday. An English executioner was specially called in to carry out the sentence. As a result, public demonstrations were held outside the prison while the hanging was proceeding. The demonstrators carried banners inscribed, "English hangman destroys an Irishman. Is this justice? Is this freedom?" The police dispersed the crowd. For Albert Pierrepoint, it was the beginning of a new life. At 8 o'clock, he remembered, an official gave us the signal. I followed my uncle into the cell. I noticed that a priest was there and saw little else. I followed my uncle the short distance out to the scaffold, strapped the legs, moved back, and had hardly time to get my balance, let alone look up, when there was a bang and then a space of complete silence. The traps were open. The rope was straight and motionless. The man was dead. When it was all over, there followed the formalities, a doctor confirming death. What surprised Albert was something else. I suddenly realised that the chief prison officer was holding a glass of whiskey out towards me. He had somehow produced a full bottle and some glasses and was pouring drinks for all the witnesses. This drinking culture around executions remained long into the future. And in his research, David Doyle unearthed an extraordinary memorandum from the Department of Justice sent after a later execution, inquiring, and I quote, as to the special circumstances which made it necessary to obtain so much whiskey. The Deputy Governor responded that an execution was, quote, a most undesirable and unpleasant experience for the officials concerned, and that 3 and sometimes 4 bottles of whiskey were purchased for such occasions. What do you do after taking part in a hanging, after ending the life of a man, good, bad, or indifferent? Albert recalled his uncle suggesting that they go to the Guinness brewery, where he had a friend working. We called at the brewery, and my uncle drank a sample or two. I had 1 glass myself, of some special new porter they were introducing, but I found it did not agree with me. But later, in kind of serious talk, his uncle said something quite profound. He was proud of young Albert for not taking the whiskey after the hanging. You'll always have to rely on yourself, he said. That means you can't blow yourself up or drink yourself up to be anybody else. You've got to be yourself when you're doing this job. If you can't do it without whiskey, don't do it at all. They walked from the city to Dún Laoghaire, no small journey, and boarded the night boat to Holyhead. Ireland would come to be important in the career of the younger Pierrepoint. And people in Ireland knew who he was. I mean, even the family business in Britain attracted a lot of attention in the Irish press. I mean, in April 1936, an execution in Birmingham was a major news story here. Nurse Waddingham, mother to 5, including a 3-month-old baby, was found guilty of murder, and some 10,000 people protested the sentence of death that was passed on that occasion. Violet van der Elst, who was a leading campaigner for the abolition of capital punishment in Britain, led the demonstrations, and Albert was damning of her efforts. The crowd strained to hear the crash of the trap doors. They never could hear it, but some abolitionist would obligingly thump the door panel of a car with a flat hand. Then the tension snapped into savage hysteria as the mob rushed the gates of the prison. But whatever about people killing their spouses, their neighbours, their employers, and the like, political tensions could transform the landscape of the job. And with what the British called World War II and we called the emergency, that meant that political executions were back on the agenda. When Albert Pierrepoint heard Winston Churchill speak of British quislings and traitors and the vengeance they could expect, he knew that if ever their fate was to be settled by legal means, they would probably come before him and his uncle. 16 US soldiers would be hanged in Somerset, England during the war for offences including rape, spying for Nazi Germany. Most of those men were hanged by Thomas. The Irish state faced its own political challenges in the war. 7 IRA men would be executed between 1940 and 45, with 6 of them in this jurisdiction. And most of them went before firing squads, a form of death which of course evoked earlier times. One man, Patrick McGrath, was actually a 1916 veteran who had been arrested following a significant gun battle in Leafy Rathgar, during which 2 special branch men were killed. It's definitely a story for another day in that. But there was also a high-profile hanging with the death of Charlie Kerins, IRA Chief of Staff and just 26 years of age. From Tralee, Charlie found himself before the Special Criminal Court, charged with the shooting dead of Detective Dinny O'Brien, who'd been gunned down by a Thompson submachine gun outside of his home. A really horrible end. Charlie Kerins refused to recognise the court, and with the sentence passed, the looming death of Kerins sparked real opposition in the Dáil right across the floor. Even those from very different political traditions, like Oliver J. Flanagan, were against the policy of execution. And as Anthony Galvin writes in his book Ring of Death, a government spokesman said that the deputies could debate the matter the following afternoon after the execution. Now, in the lead up to the hanging of Charlie Kerins, the tension in Dublin was palpable. Wartime censorship was in full effect, but protests were still significant, including one at the Mansion House, called by the Lord Mayor, and a demonstration on O'Connell Street, which was broken up by batons. One Republican would recall years later to the historian Unshin McKeown, in the run-up to the date of the hanging, around 20 of us were locked into the Bridewell for 10 days. They could hold us there until the thing was over, and that was their sole purpose, to prevent any form of public protest. In the Department of Justice files in the National Archives, it's really clear how terrified the state was of Charlie Kerins becoming a martyr. I mean, he was a very young man. Arthur Fields, the photographer who would stand on the O'Connell Bridge snapping people as they went by, he took an image of Charlie Kerins, and that someone as young as that, an IRA Chief of Staff, was perhaps indicative of how up against it the organisation was. Now, for Thomas and Albert Pierrepoint, this was just another job, but the security dimensions of the visit were heightened to unprecedented levels. And in a tribute of sorts, it's curious saying the governor of Mountjoy pays tribute to Charlie Kerins and said, "He was the bravest man I ever saw die by hanging. I admired Charlie Kerins for his courage and his idealism, and never more than during the moments before his death when he stood at attention on the scaffold and submitted himself to the hands of the executioners." The name Pierrepoint may not be mentioned in the song commemorating Charlie Kerins, but the hangman is. And the great poet Austin Clarke would lament how, "At Mountjoy jail, young Charlie Kerins was roped. We paid £5 to Pierrepoint. The special branch castled their plans. Quick lime the last Republicans."
First Friday morning in the month of December, the hangman from England came over the sea, and the traitors to Ireland wreak vengeance and hatred on young Charlie Cairns, the boy from Tralee.
There were other political hangings, like William Joyce, better known as Lord Ha Ha.
Calling, Germany calling. Here are the Reichsender ambush, Station Bremen and Station VXB on the 31 meter band.
Curious Irish-American turned Nazi radio propagandist. Time magazine telling their readers, traitor William Joyce, 39, played chess with a warder till midnight, then went to bed in his Wandsworth cell. Chief hangman Albert Pierrepoint, 37, made things snug for his first solo job since taking over from his uncle Thomas, then went to bed in the prison library. At 6, Joyce rose and washed, but did not bother to shave. At the gallows, Pierrepoint was waiting. Round the neck of the frozen-faced traitor, he expertly draped the noose. Then he sprang the trap. Everyone remembered a name like Lord Ha Ha. But the last person hanged here was Michael Manning, 25, when he went to his death in Mountjoy in 1954. Manning had been found guilty of a heinous crime, the rape and murder of Catherine Cooper, a 65-year-old nurse. And it was a really shocking and quite brutal crime described in detail. Manning did not deny it, but significantly Cooper's family voiced their own opposition to the death sentence and capital punishment. Of the Manning hanging, Albert Pierrepoint would comment, "I love hanging Irishmen. They always go quietly and without trouble. They're Christian men, and I believe they're going to a better place." By then, voices for the abolition of the death penalty were really growing, both here and in Britain. In Ireland, Sean McBride comes to mind. Sean's father, Major John McBride, had gone to the firing squad in 1916. Sean, of course, later founded Amnesty International, but he was one of the most consistent voices in the country calling for the abolition of capital punishment. There were others too. In the Shannon, Senator Sheehy Skeffington noted, in France, up to an astonishingly recent time within my memory, it was the practice to carry out executions in public in the open street. A guillotine was set up, and the object of that was to show the public just what an execution means for the purpose of instilling fear into potential murderers. I think that notion is a horrifying one, though it is logical, if you regard the death penalty as necessary because it is a deterrent. But the effect of this, as has been well pointed out, is in fact the contrary. And it's probably surprising to many listeners, it was surprising to me to hear that the guillotine was being used in France into the second half of the 20th century. But there was an emerging cultural condemnation of the death penalty as well. Take, for example, The Queer Fellow, Brendan Behan's 1956 play directed by Joan Littlewood, which, while very funny, ultimately had a very important point to make. And that play, about a man on the eve of execution, coincided with enormous discussion in British public life and politics around capital punishment. And reflecting on the bravery of Joan Littlewood putting on that play, one obituary said, "No politician or campaigner could have provided a more elegant argument in support of the abolition of capital punishment than she did then." When the Irish government announced the abolition of capital punishment in most circumstances in 1964, Behan was asked to give his 2 cents. Now, he's a little bit worse for wear, but there's trauma as well in the voice.
Well, this is not, John, my usual form to praise ministers for justice for various reasons which are not explicable on a television air. But the move of the present Minister for Justice shows a good heart and an Irish heart. I've done each other this about it. Nobody that was ever inside before likes going to the gallows, because in various cases people have swung for a half hour or maybe an hour or just left there.
But this was for ordinary murder. And for political offences, it remained on the books. So take the case of the Murrays, who received a capital murder conviction for the deaths of Garda Michael Reynolds following a bank robbery in suburban Dublin. Now, that capital murder punishment was finally abolished in 1990 and replaced with the 40-year sentence for exceptional murders. What became of Albert Pierrepoint? Well, he became not only a best-selling author, but also a publican, pulling the taps at, what a name for a pub. This name was already on the pub, by the way, in Oldham. The Help the Poor Struggler. What a peculiarly named establishment for a hangman's pub. Help the Poor Struggler. And at first he juggled his jobs. Now, I think he's trying to shock the reader when he says this in the book. He says, I found that I could take a 3:00 plane from Dublin after conducting an execution there and be opening my bar without comment at 5:30. He liked working in a pub and running a pub. I'm a social character. I always enjoyed meeting people, and the pub became a cheerful local centre. Now, you meet all kinds of people in a British pub, of course, now and then, and Pierrepoint recalled Irish customers, one of whom told him a story that shook him. The man introduced himself as a veteran of the Republican movement. We tried to get you on many occasions in the past, but could never find you. It's all over now, so it doesn't matter. Mind you, we only wanted to detain you. We waited at stations and airports and everywhere. Pierrepoint's pub became something of a tourist attraction. He was kind of furious at the false newspaper story about a sign on the counter reading, "No hanging about this bar." He didn't talk about his other job at that one. But Pierrepoint's moral opposition to capital punishment, in the end, I think is one of the most enduring parts of this story. I mean, if this guy who had seen it up close and in the flesh hundreds of times came away believing it to be futile, that surely counts for something. And there was a sadness about Pierrepoint in later interviews. Some people felt it was cynical, a former assistant noting, "This from the man who proudly told me that he'd done more jobs than any other executioner in English history. I just could not believe it. When you've hanged more than 680 people, it's a hell of a time to find out you do not believe capital punishment achieved anything." But if we take Pierrepoint at face value, his memoir stands as an important work and a condemnation of the death penalty. And while most of his work was done in Britain, the name Pierrepoint will always recall the prison on the North Circular Road. Thank you so much for tuning in to this edition of the Three Castles Burning podcast.